Welcome to This Explainer. We're diving straight into a really fascinating question today. How do massive political shifts actually begin? I mean, we usually picture revolutions as these sudden, explosive events, right? But what if the groundwork for one of the largest independence movements in human history was actually laid in meeting halls, through, carefully worded documents by folks who just wanted to work within the system? Today, we're unpacking the early constitutional roots of the Indian national movement, a period that absolutely fundamentally shaped the future of India.
So, can polite letters start a revolution? Let's dive into this. Because, like I said, we usually picture revolutions with dramatic uprisings, barricades, overnight regime changes, the whole shebang. But today, we're examining a movement built almost entirely on polite, constitutional methods. We're looking at a group of leaders who firmly believed that profound, lasting change could be achieved not by tearing the system down, but by methodically demanding a seat at the table. It's a really powerful concept, and it honestly redefines how we think about the early push for Indian independence.
Here is our blueprint for today's explainer. We're going to move chronologically and thematically through 5 key areas: the birth of organized nationalism, meeting the moderate leaders, their polite revolution toolkit, exactly what they wanted, and finally, their legacy as the architects of future independence.
Section 1. The birth of organized nationalism, laying the foundation.
To really wrap our heads around this era, we're looking at historian Dr. Ramesh Chandra Mazumdar's framework. We are focusing on that crucial 20-year window right there in the middle, from 1885 to 1905. This marks the very first stage of organized nationalism in India. The Indian National Congress was established in 1885, and for that specific window, its leadership was primarily in the hands of moderate nationalists. And they were united by this one core belief, that India's political and economic problems could be solved entirely through constitutional and peaceful methods. Basically, they weren't looking for a war. They were looking for reform.
Moving on to Part 2, meet the moderate leaders, the middle-class pioneers.
So, who were these guys? Well, these are the intellectual architects of the era. Dadabhai Naoroji, Surendranath Banerjee, Gopal Krishna Gokhale, Firuza Shah Mehta, M.G. Ranade, and W.C. Banerjee. These pioneers were highly educated, exceptionally articulate professionals. We're talking journalists, lawyers, scholars, and they dedicated themselves completely to finding constitutional solutions to the really intense economic and political struggles facing India under British rule. They became the voice of a rapidly growing politically aware class, really stepping up to articulate the needs of the nation on a formal stage.
Okay, Section 3, the polite revolution toolkit, constitutional methods.
Now, what is really fascinating here is their intentional restraint. They deliberately avoided revolutionary violence in favor of a highly specific, peaceful approach. When we look at their toolkit, they essentially ran the 19th century equivalent of a massive, highly coordinated email campaign. They relied heavily on submitting formal petitions, resolutions, and representations directly to the British government. But they didn't just stop there. They organized massive public meetings to generate political awareness among everyday Indians. They heavily utilized the press and publications to spread nationalist ideas and critique government policies. The overarching strategy? Well, it was to push for legislative reform, basically demanding greater Indian representation in councils and administration by using the system's very own rules against it.
Which brings us to Section 4. What did they want? The blueprint for reform.
So, if they're writing all these petitions and organizing all these assemblies, what exactly was the goal? Well, their blueprint brilliantly illustrates a dual focus. On the political and administrative side, they were demanding a real, tangible voice. They wanted the expansion of legislative councils, greater participation of Indians in the actual administration of their own country, the Indianization of the civil services, and, of course, vital improvements to education. But they were equally focused on the economic reality. They aggressively pushed back against the heavy financial burdens imposed by the British. They demanded a reduction in excessive taxation and military expenditure. Plus, they explicitly called for the protection of Indian industries and broader economic reforms. It wasn't just a list of complaints. It was a comprehensive, deeply thought-out blueprint for a much more equitable society.
Finally, Section 5, Architects of Future Independence, the Reality and the Legacy.
As we look back at this, we really have to look objectively at their achievements. And yeah, there's shortcomings too. Let's first look at the ceiling. Critics rightly point out that this movement was largely confined to the educated middle class. And their methods, well, they were strictly limited to petitions, speeches, and constitutional appeals. They just didn't have that massive grassroots street-level power. But Consider the foundation. Their monumental success was in creating widespread political awareness and planting the absolute seed of national unity. I mean, they successfully exposed the economic exploitation of India by British rule, which was a massive intellectual achievement at the time. They trained an entire generation of future political leaders, and crucially, they created a common political platform through the Indian National Congress. They quite literally prepared the ground for the more extremist and mass nationalist phases that were about to follow.
So the really crucial takeaway here is that the moderate phase wasn't about instant gratification. It wasn't about immediately achieving independence. It was important because it laid the political and intellectual foundation for the wider Indian national movement. They were the architects who poured the intellectual concrete. Honestly, without their meticulous, sometimes frustrating, but incredibly patient work, the massive mass nationalist movements of the 20th century simply would not have had a platform to stand on.
Just to lock all of this in, let's trace this step by step. It starts with the moderates from 1885 to 1905, utilizing their peaceful methods and petitions. Now, this pursuit of constitutional reforms directly sparked growing political awareness right across the country, which ultimately built the unshakable foundation for future nationalism. It's a really clear evolution, showing how strongly worded letters and polite resolutions steadily built a unified, politically aware India. And that brings us to the end of our explainer, leaving us with a pretty powerful thought to ponder. We so often dismiss moderate, slow-moving political actions today as ineffective, or maybe just too focused on procedure. But when you look at the polite, methodical political campaigns happening in our world right now, the petitions, the policy papers, the endless committee meetings, could you actually be witnessing the vital, foundational blueprint for tomorrow's history? History really shows us that the loudest revolutions often start with the quietest, most persistent demands for just a seat at the table. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the architects of independence, and keep asking those big questions.